Daniel used to believe that love, once chosen, simply stayed. It didn't need daily tending, he thought, just loyalty, routine, and time. For 7 years, that belief shaped his life with Mark. They shared an apartment, a calendar filled with overlapping obligations, and a quiet understanding that neither of them questioned anymore. On the surface, it looked stable. Underneath, Daniel felt like a guest in his own relationship. Mark was not cruel. That made everything harder. He was dependable, successful, and unfailingly polite, even at home. But politeness slowly replaced affection. Conversations became transactional: who would cook, who would pay the bill, who would be late. When Daniel spoke about his feelings, Mark listened with the distant patience of someone waiting for a meeting to end. There were no fights dramatic enough to justify leaving, only a constant, dull absence that Daniel could never quite name. By his mid-30s, Daniel had learned how to ignore that absence during the day. It returned at night, especially when Mark fell asleep facing the opposite side of the bed. That was when Daniel's thoughts grew loud. He began to wonder when being chosen had stopped feeling like being wanted. The yoga studio entered his life quietly, almost accidentally. A coworker mentioned it after Daniel complained about stress and sleeplessness. Yoga, Daniel thought, sounded harmless, something neutral, something that didn't threaten the fragile balance of his relationship. Mark barely looked up from his phone when Daniel mentioned signing up. The studio was minimalist and calm, all pale wood and soft light. Daniel noticed the silence first, how it demanded attention without asking for it. That was where he first saw Ethan. Ethan was not striking in an obvious way. He didn't command the room with volume or charisma. Instead, he moved with deliberate ease, his voice steady and measured, as if he was never in a hurry to prove anything. When he spoke, people listened, not because they had to, but because it felt natural to do so. During that first class, Ethan corrected Daniel's posture with a brief, respectful touch, then met his eyes and nodded. "Good," he said quietly. It was a small word, but it landed heavier than Daniel expected. He realized, uncomfortably, that it had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him with that kind of focused attention. Daniel told himself not to read into it. Ethan treated everyone with the same calm professionalism. Still, something shifted. Yoga became the one part of Daniel's week that felt intentional rather than obligatory. He arrived early, stayed present, and left feeling lighter than when he'd entered. Over time, Ethan learned Daniel's name. Then he remembered details: Daniel's stiff shoulders, his habit of holding his breath during difficult poses. Their exchanges were brief, appropriate, and public, yet they carried a warmth Daniel hadn't realized he was craving. At home, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Mark asked about Daniel's day out of habit, not curiosity. When Daniel mentioned yoga, Mark smiled distractedly and changed the subject. Daniel stopped trying to explain why it mattered to him. Weeks passed. The emotional gap between Daniel and Mark widened, not through conflict but neglect. Meanwhile, the yoga studio became a refuge, structured, quiet, predictable in a way that felt safe. Ethan never crossed a line, never lingered too long, never said anything that couldn't be explained away. That restraint made the connection feel cleaner, almost innocent. Daniel noticed himself anticipating Ethan's classes more than he was comfortable admitting. He began measuring his weeks around them. He told himself this was self-care, nothing more. After all, he hadn't touched anyone. He hadn't lied, at least not directly, but secrecy has a way of announcing itself internally before it shows on the surface. Daniel found himself withholding details, minimizing his enthusiasm, guarding something unnamed but precious. He didn't ask why. He was afraid of the answer. One evening, after class, Ethan offered a simple suggestion about breathing techniques Daniel could use at home. Their eyes met again, just long enough for Daniel to feel a quiet recognition pass between them, something unspoken, something neither of them acknowledged. That night, lying beside Mark's sleeping form, Daniel stared at the ceiling and felt an unfamiliar mix of calm and unease. He realized that without meaning to, he had begun stepping towards something he didn't yet understand, and for the first time in years, the thought both terrified and awakened him. The shift was gradual enough that Daniel could pretend it wasn't happening. What began as brief exchanges after class turned into conversations that lingered just a little longer. Ethan never rushed him out the door. He listened with the same steady attention he brought to teaching, his questions thoughtful, his reactions restrained. Daniel found himself speaking more freely than he intended, revealing frustrations he had never voiced aloud. They talked about discipline, about the ways people confuse endurance with happiness. Ethan spoke carefully, as if aware of the power words could carry. He never asked about Mark directly, but Daniel mentioned him anyway, framing the relationship as solid, dependable. Each time he did, something in his chest tightened, as though the words were rehearsed rather than true. At home, Mark remained unchanged. He noticed Daniel's improved mood but attributed it to exercise. When Daniel suggested having dinner together without distractions, Mark agreed, and spent most of the evening answering emails. The disappointment settled quietly, familiar and heavy. Daniel didn't argue. He told himself this was normal, that long-term relationships inevitably thinned into something practical. The yoga studio, by contrast, felt vivid. During one class, Ethan paired Daniel with a breathing exercise that required trust and stillness. Their proximity was professional, yet the awareness between them was undeniable. Daniel felt it in the way his focus sharpened, in the strange calm that followed. He told himself this was what mindfulness was supposed to feel like. After class, Ethan suggested a private session to help with Daniel's persistent tension. The offer was framed as instruction, nothing more. Daniel hesitated only briefly before agreeing. He justified it easily. This was about health, about balance. The session took place on a quiet afternoon. The studio was empty, the lights softer than usual. Ethan guided Daniel through slow movements, his voice lower, more deliberate. The space between them felt charged, though nothing inappropriate occurred. Still, Daniel was acutely aware of every pause, every breath. At one point, Ethan stopped and met Daniel's gaze. "You carry a lot," he said, not unkindly. The word struck deeper than Daniel expected. Without thinking, he nodded. He didn't explain what that weight was, but Ethan seemed to understand anyway. That silent understanding unsettled him more than any confession could have. Afterward, they sat on the floor, talking. This time, the conversation drifted beyond yoga. Ethan spoke about choosing a life that aligned with truth, not obligation. Daniel listened, absorbing each word like permission he hadn't known he was seeking. He didn't notice when the line between teacher and student blurred, only that it did. That evening, Daniel didn't mention the private session to Mark. The omission felt small, almost harmless. But it lingered in his thoughts, demanding attention. He reassured himself that nothing had happened, that secrecy didn't automatically equal betrayal. Yet he slept poorly, haunted by the ease with which he had concealed the truth. Over the following weeks, the dynamic between Daniel and Ethan grew more intimate, though still unspoken. They exchanged meaningful glances, shared moments of quiet that felt deliberately chosen. Daniel began to recognize a dangerous pattern. He felt more understood in silence with Ethan than in conversation with Mark. Mark, for his part, began to sense the distance. He asked Daniel if something was wrong, his tone cautious. Daniel denied it too quickly. The lie surprised them both. Mark didn't press further, and the opportunity for honesty passed. The breaking point came unexpectedly. After a late class, Ethan mentioned an upcoming break, a pause in teaching. The idea unsettled Daniel more than it should have. He realized then how much of his emotional stability had come to rest on those sessions, on that connection. As they stood near the door, neither moving to leave, Ethan spoke softly. "Sometimes people come here thinking they're fixing their bodies," he said. "But it's usually something else." Daniel swallowed. The air between them felt heavy, deliberate. He didn't step back when Ethan's hand brushed his arm, an innocent gesture that lingered a fraction too long. In that moment, the truth became unavoidable. Daniel had already crossed a line, even if the world couldn't see it yet. When he returned home, Mark was asleep, unaware of the quiet fracture forming beneath their shared life. Daniel lay awake, staring into the darkness, knowing that whatever came next would demand a choice he could no longer postpone. and the part of him that should have been afraid was already leaning forward. The truth surfaced not with drama, but with exhaustion. Daniel grew tired of managing two emotional realities that refused to coexist. Mark noticed first, not the affair itself, but the absence Daniel could no longer disguise. Conversation stalled. Touch became tentative. The apartment felt smaller, crowded with unsaid things. One evening, Mark finally asked the question he'd been circling for weeks. "Are you still here with me?" His voice wasn't accusatory, just warned. Daniel considered lying again. The habit was already formed. But something in Mark's expression, hope mixed with resignation, made the effort feel cruel. He sat down, steadying himself, and told the truth without embellishment. He spoke carefully, avoiding details, framing it as emotional rather than physical. The distinction offered no comfort. Mark listened in silence. When Daniel finished, the room felt stripped bare. Mark's response was quiet but devastating. "So you found what you needed somewhere else," he said. It wasn't a question. Daniel tried to explain that it wasn't planned, that he hadn't meant for it to happen. The words sounded hollow even to him. Mark stood, nodding as if confirming something he had long suspected. There was no shouting, no pleading. Just the slow recognition that whatever they had been preserving was already gone. That night, Mark slept on the couch. By morning, the decision felt inevitable. They spoke practically, about space, about logistics, about time. The relationship ended not with finality, but with a shared understanding that staying would only deepen the damage. Daniel expected relief. Instead, he felt exposed. Without Mark's presence anchoring his routine, the weight of his choices settled fully on him. He reached out to Ethan, unsure of what he was seeking: comfort, clarity, or permission. Ethan responded cautiously. They met in public, deliberately. Daniel confessed what had happened, his voice low and uncertain. Ethan listened, his expression tightening with concern rather than triumph. When Daniel finished, Ethan exhaled slowly. "I never wanted to be the reason something broke," Ethan said. There was no judgment in his tone, only resolve. He explained that whatever connection they shared could not begin in the aftermath of betrayal. He needed distance, not as punishment, but as principle. The rejection stung more than Daniel anticipated. He had imagined Ethan as the answer to his restlessness, the proof that his unhappiness had a clear solution. Instead, Ethan's restraint forced him to confront a harder truth: the affair had revealed a problem, not solved it. Weeks passed. Daniel moved through his days with deliberate care, resisting the urge to replace reflection with distraction. He began therapy, not to justify his actions, but to understand them. He spoke about endurance masquerading as loyalty, about the fear of choosing change over familiarity. Slowly, the narrative he'd built around himself began to unravel. One afternoon, Daniel returned to the yoga studio, not for Ethan's class, but for his own. The space felt different now, less charged, more honest. Afterward, Ethan approached him briefly. Their exchange was polite, restrained, respectful. The connection was still there, but it no longer demanded resolution. As Daniel left, he felt something unfamiliar: acceptance. Not forgiveness, not closure, but the understanding that growth often arrives disguised as loss. He had betrayed someone he once loved, and the consequences were real. Yet the experience had stripped away illusions he could no longer afford to keep. That night, alone in his apartment, Daniel reflected on the past year. He didn't regret seeking more from life. He regretted the way he had gone about it. The distinction mattered. The story didn't end with a new romance or a dramatic reunion. It ended with Daniel choosing honesty, first with himself, then with the world. And though the future remained uncertain, it was no longer something he feared. For the first time, the path forward felt earned. Daniel's life did not dramatically improve after everything ended. That was the first truth he had to accept. There was no sudden clarity, no cinematic rebirth. What came instead was quiet, a long stretch of ordinary days where the consequences of his choices echoed without interruption. The silence forced him to listen to himself in a way he never had before. Living alone reshaped his routines. He cooked smaller meals, slept diagonally across the bed, and noticed how often he reached for his phone out of habit, half expecting a message that never came. Mark had moved on with dignity, offering no updates and asking for none. That restraint hurt, but Daniel understood it. Some boundaries existed to prevent reopening wounds that hadn't healed. Yoga remained part of Daniel's life, though it no longer served as an escape. It became grounding instead, an anchor rather than a refuge. Ethan taught with the same calm authority as before, but their interactions were deliberately limited. Professional. Respectful. Daniel appreciated the clarity even as he mourned what might have been. Over time, Daniel began to recognize how much he had projected onto Ethan. He hadn't fallen in love with the man so much as with the version of himself that felt seen in Ethan's presence. That realization was humbling. It stripped the affair of its romantic justification and revealed it as a mirror, one that reflected his own unmet needs and avoided truths. Therapy continued to challenge him. Daniel learned that infidelity rarely begins with attraction alone. It begins with avoidance, with choosing comfort over confrontation. He had stayed too long in a relationship that no longer fit, then sought validation instead of honesty. Naming that pattern didn't absolve him, but it gave him language, and with language came responsibility. One evening, months later, Daniel ran into Mark by chance at a grocery store. The encounter was brief and civil. They exchanged polite words, neither probing nor retreating. As they parted, Mark offered a small, genuine smile. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't bitterness either. Daniel carried that moment home with him, lighter than he expected. Not long after, Ethan announced he would be leaving the studio to teach elsewhere. The news stirred something in Daniel, but it no longer destabilized him. When they spoke privately for the last time, there was no tension, only acknowledgement. "You're doing better," Ethan said, observing rather than assuming. Daniel nodded. "I'm doing the work." They didn't exchange promises or confessions. They didn't need to. Whatever had once existed between them had already served its purpose. It had disrupted Daniel's life just enough to force change, then stepped aside. On his final night before Ethan's departure, Daniel returned to his apartment and sat with the quiet again. This time, it didn't feel accusatory. It felt open. He realized he no longer measured his worth by someone else's attention. He no longer mistook endurance for devotion or silence for peace. The future remained unwritten. Daniel knew he would love again, but not in the way he had before. Next time, he would speak sooner. He would listen harder. He would leave if staying required him to disappear. As he turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, Daniel felt something close to gratitude, not for the pain, but for the clarity it had carved out of it. Some lessons arrive gently. Others arrive through rupture. This one had changed him, and he intended to let it.